Deny the impact of race in discourse around the quarterback position is to deny the entire history of the quarterback position and the NFL. And I say this as someone in Philadelphia who kind of grew up becoming a football fan in the shadow of Randall Cunningham, watched the careers of Donovan McNabb, Michael Vick, and now Jalen Hurts. Philadelphia has the most games ever started by a black quarterback. I've seen the narratives from the Philly sports media about these men. I've seen the national narratives about many other quarterbacks, but to start the conversation, let's go back to the beginning. Go back to 1920 in the first year of the NFL, which at the time was the American Professional Football Conference. First ever NFL champion was the Akron Pros, who were led by Fritz Hullard, who in 1921 would also coach the team while playing running back. This is the first black coach in NFL history. He also was the first black quarterback in NFL history, because in 1923 he would play the position for the Hammond Pros. Talk about history, I think we sometimes don't appreciate how recent this stuff actually is. This man was playing in the NFL just over 100 years ago. His father fought for the Union Army in the Civil War. One of the next big thing that happened for black players in the NFL is they were banned from playing in the NFL thanks to this man, George Preston Marshall. He at the time was co-owner of the Boston Braves, who also in 1933 would be renamed the Boston Redskins before moving to Washington in 1937. He organized the NFL owners and they had a gentleman's agreement to secretly not sign any black players. So from 1933 to 1946, that's how it was. And in 1942, he explained this by saying, quote, white players, especially those from the South, would go to extremes to physically disable them, end quote, if they played against black players. Once black players are integrated back into the league, we can fast forward to 1951 when Philadelphia's own Bernie Custis is drafted in the 11th round by the Cleveland Browns. At the time, the starter was future Hall of Famer Otto Graham. The Browns said, hey, we have no need for a backup quarterback. Why don't you go play safety? To which he said, no, I'm a quarterback. I'm not going to do that. This right here is something we will see done to black quarterbacks basically up until this day. There were people suggesting that Lamar Jackson transition to wide receiver rather than playing quarterback coming out of college. The idea behind this is you're a good athlete, you're not a quarterback, so why don't you go play another position? See, the Browns then said to Bernie, okay, we'll cut you on the condition you do not sign with another team in the NFL. What he did was he went to Canada and played quarterback for the Hamilton Tiger Cats, who were playing in the league that would eventually become the CFL. He would pass away in Ontario in 2017. 2 years before Bernie, we saw George Taliaferro, who played a variety of positions, one of them being quarterback. November 22nd, 1953, he became the first black man ever to start at quarterback after the ban on black players. Also worth mentioning, Willie Thrower, also from Pennsylvania, who played for the Bears in 1953. On October 18th, 1953, the Bears were playing the Niners. The starting quarterback was white, was playing like shit. They pulled him out and put in Willie, who during that drive drove his team down the field to the 15-yard line and then was not allowed to score a touchdown. They put the white quarterback back in to finish off the drive. The following year, Willie would go to play in Canada. We moved into the 60s and 70s. We started to see this idea called racial stacking, where people involved with the sport basically had certain stereotypes they associated with each position, and they decided who could play them and who couldn't. So quarterback and middle linebacker were primarily reserved for white players. The idea with those two positions leading their respective units was that those positions are too cerebral for black players. This is simply rooted in racism. This is the core foundation of all of this stuff I'm talking about quarterbacks. The positions they tried to push black players into was defensive back. So in 1968, when Marlon Briscoe was drafted by the Broncos as a quarterback, they said, hey, how about you play DB? This is a man who had been a star quarterback at Omaha University. This is what he was. So he said, I'm not signing with you unless you allow me quarterback camp to try out before training camp. This is a man who loved the position. He grew up watching and idolizing Johnny Unitas. He said, yes, at that training camp, there were 7 other quarterbacks. Every single one of them was white. They would do a drill. Each quarterback would go through it 10 times. He would always go last. He would get 7 or 8 opportunities to the 10 of the other 7 men. After camp, they said, congratulations, you are now a cornerback. Starting quarterback broke his collarbone. The backup was terrible. So what do you know? On September 29th, 1968, Briscoe was thrown into service and he did not disappoint. He played 5 full games for the Broncos that year. He threw for 1,600 yards, 14 passing touchdowns, rushed for another 300, 3 more rushing touchdowns. He was the runner-up for AFL Rookie of the Year. You want to know what the Broncos did in 1969 without telling him? They held their quarterback meetings before the season. He was not invited. He didn't even know it was happening. They had decided he was not even going to be considered as a starter. He went to the team and he asked for a trade. He went off to the Buffalo Bills. He moved to wide receiver, where he would become a star and multiple-time Super Bowl champion with the Dolphins. A year after moving from quarterback to receiver, he caught 57 passes for over 1,000 yards, 8 touchdowns for the Bills, but he always wondered what could have been if he was allowed to develop as a quarterback. Same year, Briscoe moved to the Bills and started playing playing wide receiver, the Bills drafted James Shaq Harris in the 8th round. This is a man that was told, if you say you're going to play a position besides quarterback, you can get drafted much higher, make more money. He said, no, I'm a quarterback. There would be another rookie drafted by the Bills in 1969 by the name of O.J. Simpson. Harris would sputter a bit as a Bill, but in 1972, he would sign with the Los Angeles Rams. 6 weeks into the season, he would take the starter's job. In his first game, he would throw for 280 yards and 3 touchdowns, rushing for another, completing 12 of 15 passes against the Niners, and he would lock himself in as a successful starter. In 1974, he'd become the first black quarterback ever to start and win an NFL playoff game. He also was named to the Pro Bowl that year. He was the MVP of the Pro Bowl. In 1975, he became the first black quarterback to ever open a season as a starter for a team. He played well up until week 13. When he hurt his shoulder, Ron Jaworski, who would come to Philadelphia, would take his job, and he would really never recover from this moment. The other thing Harris got only 50 years ago, along with his success, was consistent threats. He got death threats all the time, hate mail constantly, had to have security guards with him at all times. On the field, off the field, at hotels, everywhere. Actually, from the moment he got hurt in that Week 13 game in 1975, the Rams owner, Carroll Rosenblum, was putting pressure on Chuck Knox, the head coach, to find another quarterback, to play the backups, and to not reinvigorate the career of Harris. Everyone was aware of this dynamic in LA. It drove him out of the city to San Diego. A young Skip Bayless is one of the people that was covering this. It was a moment with a lot of tense and strange quarterback situations in the NFL. Joe Gilliam was in Pittsburgh in 1974. There was open competition between him and Terry Bradshaw for the starting job, which he won. The team went 4-1-1 to start the season, and he was benched. He was not playing well in those final games, but the reaction from the fans was absolutely insane. Again, with him getting death threats, hate mail, and a lot of racially motivated stuff. All this would cause him to spiral into heroin, cocaine addiction, as well as alcohol. He would end up experiencing homelessness for a while as well. This story would end tragically. In 2000, after 3 years sober, he would overdose on cocaine and lose his life. To say, Pittsburgh has a pretty bad track record overall when it comes to how they treat black quarterbacks. Cordell Stewart went through a lot in Pittsburgh, with people calling him the N-word after a home loss. Also had a cop spread a rumor that he was committing homosexual acts in a park publicly. And because of this, he dealt with tons of homophobia in Pittsburgh, but he's not a gay man. The rumor was started. I don't think anyone, regardless of their sexuality, wants people making up rumors that they were, publicly engaging in sex acts, as a professional athlete. This tarnished his reputation. The thing is, when you jump ahead to Pittsburgh, you understand that they tolerated an alleged rapist, right? Because they thought his play was good enough. Also, he was a white man, so this was okay, right? I think the discourse around Ben Roethlisberger makes for an interesting comparison to the discourse around Mike Vick, who was involved with dogfighting, other criminal enterprises. This man went to prison and totally changed his life. He did the time. He lost 3 years of the NFL, 3 years of his life. Then he came back out and changed his life in a positive direction and never looked back. Even after he did the time and changed his life, people still hated this man way more than Ben Roethlisberger. The discourse there was very different. Why is that? Now Pittsburgh tolerates one of the biggest douchebags in the history of the NFL, one of the most selfish, arrogant, ignorant, entitled players I've ever seen in any sport. This man's own family cut him off because he's such an asshole. Cordell Stewart got beat down with racism over and over again, culminating in a moment at the Hall of Fame induction for Jerome Bettis. The Steelers owner, Dan Rooney, coming up to him and saying, "You would have been better as a wide receiver." Stepping away from Pittsburgh and jumping back in time to 1978, we can talk about the first black quarterback ever drafted in the first round. That is Doug Williams. Doug was drafted by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who at the time were an absolute joke, but he brought them to the playoffs 3 times in 5 years. Despite his talent and pretty much single-handedly turning around that franchise, he was making $120,000 per year, the lowest total for a starting quarterback in the NFL and less than many backups. After 1982, he asked for $600,000 per year, and the owner, Hugh Culverhouse, who was a complete piece of shit, said, "I'm not budging past $400K. What Doug did is he said, "Hey, go fuck yourself," and he sat out the entire 1983 season. The team went 2-14. They would not make the playoffs again until 1997. Doug would go to the USFL for 2 years before coming back to the NFL and the Washington Redskins. Link up with Joe Gibbs, become the starting quarterback, and lead this team to Super Bowl 22. He was the first black quarterback to start the Super Bowl and the first to win. The day before the Super Bowl, this man had a 6-hour-long root canal surgery, and in the Super Bowl, they won 42-10. He threw 4 touchdowns in the second quarter alone. That's a record. Threw for 340 yards in this game, breaking a record that had been set by Joe Montana. If he would get hurt the following year, his career would never really recover, and he wouldn't get any attention from any other teams after leaving beating the Redskins. Around the same time, we saw another man who helped change the game experiencing his own wild ride, and that is Warren Moon. Moon was a star quarterback for the Washington Huskies. He was the MVP of the Rose Bowl. Then he went undrafted and had to go play in the Canadian Football League to prove himself. This man went and played for the Edmonton Eskimos from 1978 to 1983 before coming into the NFL and getting a shot with the Houston Oilers. What black quarterbacks from this era of football proved is you had to do so much more just to get a foot in the door. To be noticed, you had to do something really special, and then to stay there, you had to be essentially perfect. There was no wiggle room. Warren Moon would go on to be the first black quarterback ever to make it into the NFL Hall of Fame. Brings us to an Eagles player that really changed the game after Warren Moon. That is Randall Cunningham. Randall Cunningham was an elite quarterback who was treated as just a very good athlete by the media in Philadelphia and by national media as well. I think Randall Cunningham is one of the most pivotal quarterbacks in this conversation, and I think he started to change the way that black quarterbacks were viewed. He was the face of the franchise, but I think when you listen to people talk about him, in the back of their mind there was always, yeah, he was good, but he wasn't quite a true pocket passer, right? Not a real quarterback. Sticking with the Philadelphia narrative, in 1999 it was a huge year. In that draft, the majority of the quarterbacks drafted were black, including McNabb, who was 2 overall, as well as Dante Culpepper. Aaron Brooks was also drafted in 99. This was 4 years after Cordell Stewart had been drafted, who I already mentioned, who was also incredibly important in this conversation. 1995 was the same year we saw Steve McNair drafted, who came incredibly close to winning a Super Bowl, just like McNabb would in 2004. The thing is, when you go back to this era and you look at how some of these quarterbacks were talked about, it's incredibly strange. You see things like physical specimen used a lot around people like McNabb and Dante Culpepper. You hear these kind of phrases used, you're really just talking about the language of the slave trade. Circling back to McNabb, the rhetoric around him in Philadelphia and nationally would be very strange consistently, starting on draft day when Angelo Cataldi of WIP led the Dirty 30 to boo the pick at the time. They booed because who they wanted was Ricky Williams, who ended up going at 5, but this was a terrible moment for the city. It was very ugly. Ugly is a great way to describe the comments of Rush Limbaugh that would eventually come from McNabb, saying essentially the media props him up simply because he is a black quarterback. Want to know what's funny all these years later? I think there's a lot of quarterbacks that get propped up simply because they're a white quarterback. If Baker Mayfield was a black man turning the ball over 20 times per year, what do you think the narratives would be about Baker Mayfield? Would it be, oh, he's a scrappy competitor, or would it be he is a dumbass who turns the ball over? White quarterback like a Josh Allen or a Brett Favre puts the ball into harm's way over and over and over. They're a gunslinger, right? A black quarterback does it like Cam Newton or Caleb Williams. He's reckless with the football, right? He's not cerebral enough for the position. If a white quarterback is mobile like Steve Young, he's like sneaky athletic, right? He has a dual threat. But if a black quarterback is mobile, oh, he's just a running back who sometimes throws. White quarterback is cocky and flamboyant and loud and likes to celebrate and dance, right? This is endearing, right? People laugh, oh, haha, look at Brock Purdy. Isn't that cute? He can dance. But if a black quarterback does it and he's celebrating, he's a diva, right? It's problematic. He's taunting. He's not a good role model for kids. It's not just football, right? I saw the narratives about Allen Iverson with the whole practice debacle. This was a few months after his best friend was shot and killed. He was actively grieving, processing that, and this is how he was treated by the media. It's why he reacted how he did. I grew up as a huge fan of the Phillies, watching Chase Utley get talked about one way and Jimmy Rollins and Ryan Howard get criticized in a very different way with very different rhetoric. Just like how today Kyle Schwarber and Bryce Harper often get a pass in the city when they let the city down over and over again. People like Joel Embiid get hammered, and I think Embiid's done things to be criticized for absolutely over and over, but the rhetoric, the energy behind it is different. This is not just true in Philadelphia. The same narratives I was talking about from the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, they still exist today. I think there are a lot of reasons to admire Jalen Hurts, but he carries on the legacy of these men. It's a legacy that in Philadelphia goes back to Randall Cunningham, who reached out to Jalen personally after their Super Bowl win and his MVP. This to say, when you talk about the quarterback position, you cannot ignore all of this history, and if you do, you are either ignorant or you are just plain stupid.